conference, which we are very proud to offer in partnership with Associated Grantmakers and the Learning by Giving Foundation. I want to start by thanking our colleagues in both of those organizations. At AGM in particular, I have to give a call out to Jen Lammers, who has been a true thought partner in helping to conceptualize the content and structure of today's conference. Those of you who are familiar with the great work she's been doing in developing programs at AGM will recognize her intellectual fingerprints on several of today's panels. The Learning by Giving Foundation has once again given us the honor of hosting the culmination of Decisions with Impact, a national philanthropy video competition in which students from the schools that Learning by Giving funds across the country to participate in experiential philanthropy programs are invited to produce a 3-minute video about the nonprofit organization of their choice that reflects their philanthropic strategies and values. The 5 finalists will be on display today. We're getting a television set up. You'll be able to see the 5 finalist videos throughout the day. And then this afternoon, I hope you'll come back to this room after the workshops, and the winner of the National Philanthropy Video Contest will be announced. The nonprofit featured in the winning video will receive a $10,000 grant from the Learning by Giving Foundation, and I think you'll be very impressed by the work that the students have been doing in that area. The kind of experiential philanthropy program that the Learning by Giving Foundation supports is what made it possible for us to create Northeastern Students for Giving 5 years ago. And I could not be more proud of the students here at Northeastern who have embraced the opportunity, and students across the country have. And in fact, where are our friends from Binghamton? Can I get a hand from them? We have 11 students and a professor who have come from Binghamton, New York today, who are part of the Learning by Giving Foundation. And I just want to thank you for making that trip. It is such a pleasure to have you with us. The students involved in the Learning by Giving Foundation, I think across the country, have taken advantage of this opportunity to use the resources they've been trusted with so effectively and conscientiously. And I think the topics that our students here at Northeastern chose this year reflect that. They are about to be making their decisions for this year's grants in the areas of post-incarceration reintegration and community mental health. And I think the timeliness and relevance of both of those topics speaks to how conscientious they're trying to be with the money that they're using. We have students from NS4G who have been involved in all aspects of managing our program and helping us get ready for today. And there are a lot of students who are going to be in the audience. So I really encourage all of the professionals who are here to take a moment to talk to a young person today, because they're very engaged, they're very enlightening, and I know from personal experience that you can learn a lot from them. We're celebrating our 5th anniversary. And it is very exciting for us to be able to do this. We started as a classroom-based grant-making activity and have been able to grow into a campus-wide program with multiple points of entry for not just students and faculty, but as those of you who are visiting today know, for community members as well. That kind of growth in just 5 years would not have been possible without the support of a lot of people. So I want to thank the Office of University Advancement for supporting us, and also the Arthur K. Watson Charitable Trust for their support of this conference. We really are indebted to them for their support. Also, I want to thank the College of Social Sciences and Humanity and the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs, in which we're housed, for their support of NS4G. We are part of the Human Services Program, an undergraduate major that prepares students for careers in social change. And we would not be able to flourish without the leadership of Lori Gardenier, our program director, who gives us just incredible support for what we're doing. And I think really has pulled together a program that energizes students and prepares them to take advantage of this kind of opportunity. I also want to thank the truly remarkable Natalia Stone, our program coordinator. I can say in all honesty that without her today would not be happening. Today's panels and workshops also reflect a lot of time, volunteers from a variety of sectors who've come together to put those together, and I thank them. Just a couple of housekeeping issues I want to mention before we go on. In a late-breaking development, one of our panels today is going to be joined by Lieutenant Governor Tim Murray. He's in the midst of a very busy day and will be whisked in and out in the midst of that panel. There won't be helicopters or police or anything like that. I don't want to get you too excited, but we are going to have to improvise to accommodate his schedule. So bear with us while we figure out how that's going to work. He gets his own podium on the edge, so we should save the extra few seconds of him walking across the stage. It'll be a little unconventional, but we're really excited to have him join us. We're going to be together all morning. When we break for lunch, if you have pre-ordered lunch, there'll be a ticket in your packet so you can pick your lunch up outside. Lunch is going to be on the 4th floor. There's a personal schedule in your folder that indicates which affinity table you chose if you don't remember. The affinity tables will all be marked so you can join people who share your interest for lunch. And students will be having lunch in their own room so that we can get together the students from all of the, I think, 6 or 7 universities who are going to be here today. After lunch, you'll go to your afternoon breakout sessions. Those are on the 4th floor. Those are on the 3rd floor. And students will be available to help you find your room if you're having any trouble. Again, at the end of the day, I hope you'll come back here after your workshops. There will be cookies and other desserts from Haley House to entice you to stay and not go run off to your email or back to your offices, because we really do hope people will come back for our closing comments from Diane McGillivray, our Senior VP of University Advancement, and Jeff Poulos from AGM, as well as the announcement of the winner of the $10,000 video competition. Your packets also include feedback forms, so we would like you, as true learners, we would like you to help us with the evaluation so we can learn from the experience today and improve next year. If you look at the back of your program, you'll see all of the information about the social media we have arranged for today. We do hope you'll help us share the learning. People are welcome to text their colleagues, as much as I discourage the use of telephones during the course of the conference. We are live streaming today, so if there's somebody who cannot be here who you think would like to watch the live stream, please go ahead and share that information. You're also welcome to post comments on our blog, and we hope that you will tweet. Our handle is WeAreNS4G, and the hashtag for today is MoveTheNeedle. I made that announcement last year and had almost no idea what I was talking about. This year, I can tell you why tweeting this conference day is important in 140 characters or less. So now that that is all out of the way, I just want to share a brief comment, because I know what we really want to do is hear Tamara Draut, not me. But I did want to share a few thoughts about the conference itself. I have come to think of the Social Impact Conference as a celebration of the expansiveness of our social impact toolkit. And one of the things I try to teach our student grant makers is that as philanthropists, we can do so much more than just write checks. How we give the money away is often just as important as how much we give away. And we play different roles at different times depending on the challenges we're taking on. Sometimes the most important thing for us to do is simply to tend to the needs of our fellow human beings. Other times we need to take risks and look for breakthrough solutions, but still other times, especially when we are feeling frustrated that the challenges that we are taking on take longer, cost more, and are harder to fix than any of us would hope, that we have to step back and look at the big picture and see if there are not bigger levers, such as policy, that we could be pushing. And there are other times when we have to take a step even further back and think about how many of us are pushing our own chosen levers in parallel with each other. We have to stop and think, can we not choreograph our efforts a little bit more deliberately, a little bit more strategically, to change the underlying structures and systems that are generating the problems that we're trying to address? And those are the topics that we are here to discuss today. The composition of the rooms, the panels, the conversations we hope to inspire are all intended to model some of the behaviors and strategies that we're hoping will be inspired by the content of the day. I hope you all have a wonderful time. I hope you have a thought-provoking and inspiring day, and I'm looking forward to catching up with a lot of you at lunch and in between sessions. And now I hope you will join me in welcoming the Interim Dean of the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs and the Director of the Law and Public Policy Program here at Northeastern University, Professor Joan Fitzgerald.
Welcome, everyone. It is a delight to be here to kick off this conference that highlights our Human Services program, which you can see up here is the only undergraduate program in our School of Public Policy, or only undergraduate major, I correct myself, in the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs. It is a major with approximately 220 students, led by 3 powerhouse women, Lori Gardenier, Emily Mann, and Rebecca Riccio, as well as a very strong staff. They do exemplary work in our school. Another aspect that you're here to hear about is their amazing organization, Northeastern Students for Giving, which gives our students hands-on experience using philanthropy strategically to achieve social change. Whether engaging in philanthropy, working all over the world in co-ops and internships, or engaging in research with faculty, experiential learning is who we are and what we do at Northeastern. Today's conference is about creating social impact and systems change, but specifically how to do so using public policy. Whether you are here today representing a nonprofit organization, a foundation, or whether you're a student hoping to enter into that world, we know that there is a politics to policy change that can sometimes be daunting. Moving from program to policy, from philanthropy to policy, though, is a leap that has tremendous payoffs in impact. That is our view here. It's also supported by recent reports from the Annie Casey Foundation and the National Committee for Responsible Philanthropy, which have recently released reports that outline a framework of strategic ways to influence policy from the foundation world. So whether your cause is reintegration after incarceration, the environment, climate change, early childhood education, I could go on in the list. This is an important leap to make in policy, and it's one that's very important to us at the Policy School. So if we look at, for example, our Dukakis Center for Urban and Regional Policy, a lot of our work on housing has been funded by the Boston Foundation. One of the more interesting studies that we do repeatedly is called a housing report card, where we look at the Commonwealth and how well it provides affordable housing. But one of the interesting findings in one of these reports was that the reason we can't develop transit-oriented development in many communities is because of that communities are reluctant to pay for education. And that has to do with zoning for multiple family housing. So the Dukakis Center was critical in creating 40R, the state development statute that was enacted in 2004 to promote dense transit-oriented development in our communities. So a real example of how a foundation supporting the research at the university has actually led to policy change in the Commonwealth. I could go on. The work of Stephanie Pollack at the Dukakis Center, funded by the Barr Foundation, is really having policy impact on how we continue to finance the MBTA, which is critical to the economic development of not only the Boston region, but the entire Commonwealth. World Class Cities Partnership is another example of research that we do in partnership with 11 cities throughout the world, engaging in research that responds to particular problems that they have. I don't want to go on too long as we're running late, but I do want to tell you not only are these the research programs, but our education programs reflect this orientation as well. Our master's degree in law and public policy gives students a perspective not only on legislation, but on how litigation is used in creating public policy. Our master's degree in urban and regional policy focuses on many of the issues I just mentioned: housing, transportation, economic development, climate change, and what kind of policies we need in cities to make a difference. And finally, our Masters of Public Administration, which works with students on becoming administrators in the nonprofit and government world. Our focus is experiential. Our students do internships, capstone projects that engage them in problem solving for real clients. And in addition, internships and various kinds of fellowships. Our alumni have been placed throughout the city, the Commonwealth, and the nation. But enough about us. I'm here today to introduce Tamara Draut. Her title is Vice President of Policy at Demos in New York. But Tamara has become famous as a spokesperson for a generation of young Americans who found that they could not get ahead no matter how hard they work because the rules of the game are stacked against them. Unaffordable tuition, student loan debt, low wages, unreliable career paths, employers no longer providing health insurance, housing becoming unaffordable, and the cost of starting a family deterring their dreams of upward advancement. But Tamara is not a complainer because she understands that these forces are structural, so she is a fighter. Her 2007 book, Strapped, eloquently and persuasively explains just how the game is rigged and what needs to be done. It is a plea for better policies, but also a plea for viable politics. In dozens of articles and radio and TV appearances that you can read about in her bio, Tamara has become a leader of a growing movement for generational justice. I'm sure she will inspire us today. Thank you.
Well, good morning. Good morning.
Good morning.
Can you hear me all the way in the back? Yes? Great, thank you. Thank you so much for that very, very kind introduction. I will try and live up to the introduction you gave me, Joan. I want to thank the Northeastern Students for Giving for actually having me here and give one disclaimer, which is that Rebecca told me to be provocative. And I should let you know I'm in a bit of an odd position right now because I work at a public policy organization, Demos, and we get a lot of our funding from foundations. So that's kind of a conflict of interest, but I will do my best to be unbiased. I'm going to talk today about the policy landscape around the issues that I know best, and that is what has happened to economic opportunity and economic security over the last 3 decades. But I think it's always best to start by talking and giving you a sense of who I am and why I do what I do. So I want to start by giving you a little bit of history about me, which is I grew up in southern Ohio. My parents worked very, very hard. They were able to scrape together money, so when it came time for me to go to college, they were able to pay the amount in full. I graduated in 4 years. I didn't have any debt. Then I waited tables for about 6 months in my hometown and moved to New York. And that was back in 1994. I think I've now earned the right to say I've been a New Yorker ever since, coming up on 20 years. So, you know, in many ways, I sort of embody the great American dream, right? The idea that if you work hard and you're dedicated and you persevere, you can get ahead in this country. And it's that ideal that has honestly facilitated, sort of fueled the desire for parents, generation after generation, to get up in the morning and go to dreary, often dangerous jobs in order to give their kids a better life. So, you know, it makes for a good story. But that's not really the right story or the accurate story of my life. So I want to try and tell it again in a way that more accurately captures all the things that enabled me to have the great privilege of being up here today speaking to all of you. All right, so let me start over. I was the first in my family to go to college and get a degree. My dad was a machinist at a union factory in Middletown, Ohio. It was a steel factory. And my mom worked for a family-owned orthodontist practice as an office manager. So I like to say that we were part of what is now pretty much an extinct class of Americans, and that is the blue-collar middle class. Now, together, my mom and dad made enough money that we really didn't lack for anything. We even took family vacations every year. 6 of us, I can tell you 6 of us crammed into a car driving down to Myrtle Beach. When it was time to go to college, my parents, at the time actually, made too much money for me to qualify for any federal financial aid. But because back then, states actually funded higher education at a level, tuitions were actually low. It was low enough that my parents could afford to pay for it out of their pocket. I didn't work while I was in school. I worked during breaks, but let's be honest, that was for fun money. That was not for college money. And because of that, I was able to participate in extracurricular activities like professional clubs in the career I wanted to be in, which at the time was advertising. That's how I met my husband. That's also how I met the future people whose couches I would sleep on in order to get my start in New York City. So I really like to think that I am the result of great American public policy. My mom and dad rode this wave that a lot of economists call the Great Compression, when the working and the middle class made great gains as this economy became ever more and more productive. Now, when I tell this story, it doesn't really discount the hard work of my parents, doesn't discount my own individual initiative and strong-headedness, but it takes into account the contours, the public policy that shaped the opportunities that both influenced my parents' ability to give me what I needed to get ahead, and ensured that their hard work and my hard work was rewarded. So I often think about whether if I was born 2 decades later, or my parents were born 2 decades later, and then I was born 2 decades later, if I would be here today. The reality is getting ahead today is a lot harder. Maybe I would have been, one of the odd successes, working multiple jobs, juggling school, juggling student loans. But the reality is if I was average, which, I am. I'm from Southern Ohio. I went to public school. I went to public university. Chances are I would have dropped out like millions of kids do every year under the enormous burden of too much work, too much loans, and too little time for school. So what has happened since I graduated, since my parents were in the height of their working lives and able to make it a good living? I look back when I go home and visit, all of the structures of opportunity have really evaporated. The middle-class jobs at the steel factory are gone. My mom got laid off when a new generation in the family took over and decided that she was too expensive and the job could be done for a lot cheaper. She was out without health care for nearly 4 years before being old enough to qualify for Medicare. After never using credit cards, she relied on them and has since filed for bankruptcy. So, and that state university that gave me my start costs 3 times today what it costs when I went to school. So all the factors that I can look back and say helped me get ahead are gone. And at the macro level, the United States, which was once known, for, our greatest invention was this strong middle class, is now more unequal than at almost any time in our history. In fact, even European nations that are well known for sort of their very rigid class structures now have more economic mobility than we do. All right, so here's the story I want to tell, and I want to bring it back to what you all care about, which is public policy. So what has happened, and why do we find ourselves today in the midst of historic levels of income inequality and in a society where the opportunity ladders really have broken down? And how in the world has this happened during a time when our nation's wealth, our overall gross domestic product, has grown by 2/3? So I believe the answer to this question lies in 3 decades of quite aggressive policy and advocacy, and much of it actually fueled by foundations and business associations, with the very real objective of undoing the social contract that built America's middle class. So one thing I think it's important to understand about this story, and in order to fully understand the story, we have to remind ourselves that the American middle class didn't just happen. It wasn't an accident. It was built. It was built through a concerted effort among employers, among workers, among government, that we all had a stake and a responsibility together. And laws flowed from that basic ideal that Americans should have a decent standard of life. It's hard to believe now, but back then, CEOs made roughly 25 times the amount of the average worker. Not the 300 times they do today. The government collected a lot more in taxes, and that money was reinvested into the things that impacted the common good, our universities, our roads, our bridges, our technological infrastructure. Now, the result was a middle class unlike the world had ever seen. And for about 30, 40 years, as business productivity rose, the workers actually shared in the gains. So a rising tide really did lift all boats. Now, it's hard to believe, but that in the middle of the century, incomes at the very bottom, this has never happened in my lifetime, grew faster than those at the very top. I almost have a hard time wrapping my head around that idea of seeing, imagine a New York Times headline that says, last quarter incomes grew for the bottom 20% of Americans at a rate faster than the top 10%. It seems absurd almost that was the case. But this grand bargain really began to unravel in the 1970s. And for the young people in the room, your parents may likely have very bad, visceral memories of the 1970s. The oil crisis, high levels of inflation, very low stagnant growth. It was a pretty scary time, and it was also an opportunity. At the same time that the economy was exhibiting all of these scary signs, the civil rights movement and the women's rights movement had really opened up the social contract in a way to people who had been excluded for for generations. Those two things combined began to sow the seeds of a long campaign to really unravel the social contract that was built. And that's what I want to spend the rest of my time talking about, which is how that unraveling happened. But before I do that, just because I think it's always important, there's some rule that you have to say something many, many times. We all hear the statistics about the scope of inequality in this country, but bear with me, I'm going to throw some numbers at you just so that we're all have our minds wrapped around what it is we are up against. So, compared to 3 decades ago, households in the bottom fifth of the income, the bottom 20%, make about $200 more a year after you adjust for inflation. So in one generation, the bottom gained $200. Meanwhile, the top 0.1% gained $5 million. In fact, in the last period of economic expansion, roughly 2002 to 2007, 2/3 of all income gains went to the top 1%. Now, we all know that all households lost a lot of income during the Great Recession, but the wealthiest among us, particularly the super-duper wealthy, and that's an official statistical category, by the way, the super-duper wealthy, have rebounded. In the first year after the end of the official end of the recession, 93% of income gains went to the top 1%, bringing them just about $100,000 in extra income. The top, in the year after the Great Recession, gained $4 million. The rest of the population, the 99%, gained $80. So, one of the things you've probably heard is that globalization and technological change are the real culprits here, that America is sort of paralyzed in the wake of these great structural changes. And, it's true. Technological change and globalization have created lots of new challenges, but they've also created lots of new challenges for every other sort of industrialized, advanced nation in the world. And the reality is, countries like Germany, the UK, France, have not experienced the kind of income inequality and the unraveling of the middle class that we have here. So, what decimated the middle class and what has created this kind of income inequality that I described is public policy. It was built by public policy, it was unraveled by public policy. and I want to tell you 3 stories about public policy. Now, the 3 trends that I would say have greatly influenced the role of public policy in economic opportunity are these 3. The rise of economic belief called Trickle-Down Economics. The second is the rise of a very coordinated big business lobby. And the third is the increasing role that money plays in our political system. All of these have helped fuel a new public policy dynamic that, as Joan said, whether you are involved in early childhood education, the environment, college affordability, constrain the ability for us to make real transformative change. All right, so let's talk a little bit about trickle-down economics. You know, this really began in the 70s, late 1970s, and it basically espouses the idea that the goal is to really deregulate the markets. If you deregulate business, you know, because businesses can police themselves, then markets will function better, prosperity will trickle down from the top, so we need to cut taxes for corporations, for the wealthiest among us, with the idea that it will trickle down. Now, I can tell you that most economists do not have that kind of power to take sort of their academic ideas and poof, get them translated into public policy. They had a lot of help. Their ideas were aggressively promoted and marketed to politicians with the backing of a whole new set of well-funded think tanks and also the rise of the big business lobby, none of whom were shy about getting involved in fights that led to advocacy and public policy change. So let's talk a little bit more about what this mindset has meant. It's meant that things like the minimum wage went from being seen as sort of the responsibility we have as a decent society to an infringement on business, and now even today as a job killer. As a result, the minimum wage, if it had kept up with inflation, the federal minimum wage, would be about $10. It's $7.25. Tax rates on the highest earners have been cut in half and are at historic lows. And this is particularly true when we look at taxing wealth, which is where the majority of higher income individuals get their income. We've had subsidy after subsidy of corporate tax breaks. So today in the United States, the share of taxes paid by corporations is far below that of other nations. And taken together, both the taxes that we get from both individuals and business puts us at the 3rd lowest of all advanced nations. The United States collects less revenue per capita than only 2 other nations, Mexico and Chile. So these public policies were ushered in through a very deliberate, assertive, and well-funded set of institutions. Now, one of the things near and dear to my heart is what has happened to the case of higher education. And here in the United States, as you know, higher education is the responsibility of states. Most of the funding comes from state appropriations. The basic idea, back when I was growing up, was that a middle-class family could afford to pay for college, and federal grants, particularly the Pell Grant, would make up the difference. Now, state funding for universities has fallen by 26% in terms of full-time, the funding per pupil of a full-time equivalent. The Pell Grant, which is our nation's biggest form of need-based aid, it doesn't have to be repaid, has used to pay for about 7 out of every $10 at a public university, the cost of a public university. Today, it pays for about 3 out of every $10. So we now have crossed the threshold of $1 trillion in student debt. And what we know is that students from low-income backgrounds are more likely to borrow and to borrow at higher amounts. So the good news is lots of foundations are funding really interesting innovations in this space, ways that we can improve developmental education, pilot programs, how can we use technology to bring greater efficiencies to the sector. And these are all really important. Universities can be run smarter, they can be run leaner, and they can be more focused on getting kids through college, young people through college. I'm sorry that I keep referring you to kids. I'm actually old enough that that kind of slips off my tongue, young people through college. But at the same time, all of these investments are going to be much harder to achieve transformative change, like the doubling of the percentage of people in this country that have a college degree, if we don't look at the underlying structure in which we are sending young people into. And that is a structure that is becoming more and more expensive and fundamentally at odds with their ability to get through college, no matter what efficiencies we gain. All right, so I told you there were three things. The second thing I want to talk about is the history around the beginning of a coordinated and pretty aggressive big business lobby. Now, if most of what I'm going to talk about is I learned in a great book, which if you haven't read it, it's Jacob Hacker's and Paul Pearson's last book, which is called Winner Take All Politics. It's a fascinating story. So a lot of political scientists point to sort of the birth of the Chamber of Commerce to the early 1970s, when when the future Supreme Court Justice Lewis Powell wrote a confidential memo that helped galvanize the business community. Now, this memo was written after Congress had passed major new regulatory legislation in the workplace and in the environment. And in the Powell memo, which is how people sort of refer to it, and I'm going to quote, he asserts that the American economic system is under broad attack. So Powell argued that this attack really required mobilization by organized business. He goes on to say, business must learn the lesson that political power is necessary, that such power must be assiduously cultivated, and that when necessary, it must be used aggressively and with determination, without the embarrassment and without the reluctance which has been so characteristic of American business. He then goes on to outline how to achieve that goal, saying that strength lies in organization and careful long-range planning and implementation, in consistency of action over an indefinite period of years, and the scale of financing available only through joint effort, and in the political power available only through united action and national organizations. It didn't take long for this vision to be implemented. In 1971, only 175 firms had registered lobbyists in Washington. By 1982, 2,500 had registered lobbyists. The number of corporate PACs increased from under 300 in 1976 to over 1,200 by the mid-1980s. And today there are 24 registered business lobbyists for every member of Congress. Now, let me give you one example of how public policy is shaped by the big business lobby, and one of the biggest of them all, which is the big banks. So for 30 years, we, as a nation, began to steadily deregulate our financial system. And Bob Kuttner is here. He is the premier expert on financial deregulation. We essentially undid the protections that basically kept commercial banking, the kind of banking most of us do, vanilla banking, separate from speculation, separate from trading, and there were usury limits on interest rates. All of this deregulation meant by the time that we hit the eve of the financial crisis that we're still feeling the effects of, some private mortgage lenders were basically writing their own rules, and we had a derivatives market worth over 30 times our GDP that was operating completely in the shadows. Now, the meltdown, which was predicted by many people, including Bob Kuttner, resulted in $9 trillion in wealth, just poof, evaporated. Now, at the same time that businesses were working on getting the laws around our banking system loosened and deregulated, a lot of foundations and a lot of organizations, including DEMOS, were working on asset building initiatives to help low-income families build wealth, a lot of it through home ownership. And these initiatives had successes. We were making progress. And they often did include advocacy and policy, things like trying to get match savings accounts or auto IRAs. But a lot of that great work that was built through effort and dedication of people on the ground has been wiped away because of the deregulation of our financial markets that led to the crash. So the reality is today that the racial wealth gap is bigger than it was, significantly wider than it was a decade ago. And I can tell you the big banks are not letting up. During the financial reform debate, they spent about $30 million in 2009 and $62 million in 2011 trying to prevent a lot of the tough reforms that would keep your money and mine safer. Now, Demos was very involved in financial reform, so this was a David and Goliath battle. We had about $1 million in total funding for folks who were advocating for greater consumer protection. Now, this type of engagement is a regular occurrence in Washington. In the last 10 years alone, the Chamber of Commerce spent $805 million, almost $1 billion, advocating on behalf of the interests of business. Which brings us to the very last trend I want to talk about that has really impacted the policy landscape, and that is the rise of money in politics. So this story starts a little longer ago, around the same, the 1970s appear to be when we really got off track. The Supreme Court ruled in 1976 that basically money was speech. And so trying to constrain the ability of people to contribute to the political system was viewed as an infringement on free speech. So, and we all know that the sort of most recent culmination of this legal theory is Citizens United, which struck down laws that limited the amount corporations could spend in an election. Now, this wouldn't matter so much if business elites and the wealthy, the donors who can write the checks to get members of Congress elected and keep them in office through re-election, wouldn't really be a problem if the interests and their policy preferences were deeply aligned with the majority of the public's. The problem is we now know that by and large is not the case. Now, there are many donors in this room, lots of folks from foundations. It doesn't mean that all wealthy people hold, bad beliefs. What the research shows is that there is a pretty significant gap between the agenda and the policy preferences of folks who earn over $1 million of income compared to everybody else. And there is a slide that I want to put up here too. So, a recent survey, there's been a lot of new academic research that has really probed the differences in public policy opinions. And the Russell Sage Foundation has found that the preferences of the wealthy, again, that's average income over $1 million, vary widely from those of the general public. Now, again, it's okay to have differences of opinions, but the reason why this trend is alarming is because the wealthy don't just hold different opinions, they actually have much greater influence over the process. So they have a much greater ability to get those opinions put into legislation and public policy. Now, there's another great book I'll recommend to you, which is Martin Gillen's Affluence and Influence. And he writes in his book that, and again, I paraphrase, but this is an academic who doesn't have a professed point of view talking about his findings. And so I want to just read them to you word for word. The American government does respond to the public's preferences, but that responsiveness is strongly tilted toward the most affluent citizens. Indeed, under most circumstances, the preferences of the vast majority of Americans appear to have essentially no impact on which policies the government does or doesn't adopt. And in his research, he shows that on many different policy outcomes, on many different public policy issues, the outcomes would have been quite different if Congress and the President had been equally responsive to all income groups. Now, the role that the donor class and the wealthy among us play tends to be a lot more critical on economic policy. Because one of the things that Gillen's found in his research is that the starkest difference in the affluent and the general population is around issues of economic policy, which is what this slide shows. And it's not just Gillen's research. It's always good to have other people to bring to the table. Another political scientist, Larry Bartels, has done similar research, finding similar patterns, and he concludes that the preferences of people in the bottom third of the income distribution have no apparent impact on the behavior of their elected officials. Our nation is really pulling apart. It's pulling apart politically, it's pulling apart economically into a really mutually and toxic reinforcing cycle. What all of this research confirms is what Justice Louis Brandeis famously said a long time ago, which is that we may have democracy or we may have wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, but we can't have both. So I'm only into the fourth decade of my life, and I have to say that the country I grew up in is now barely recognizable to me. On my block, there were blue-collar workers, teachers, a doctor, an advertising executive. It was this sort of motley mix of middle-class people. Today, the doctors live on the other side of town, the blue-collar houses are in foreclosure, and the ad executive moved out a long time ago into a gated community. We are growing distant from each other geographically, financially, culturally, and the needle is still moving in the other direction. So you all are going to spend the rest of your day talking about the role of philanthropy in public policy. And I know that's a controversial topic, and with good reason. As much as I just talked about the power of corporate and concentrated wealth in our democracy, you can say, and it has been said, about foundations and the concentration of philanthropic giving as well, that there's probably nothing more that makes it inherently good or different. To that I would say that right now there are lots of foundations and wealthy donors who are aggressively seeking to move the needle in a way that is against the public interest, that is making economic mobility disappear before our eyes. And these foundations are engaged in policy and advocacy. So I like to think that the goal of public policy is to create the conditions in which the broadest number of people can succeed, and then target special interventions for those facing more than the average number of challenges. All too often, though, it seems like we are funding the special interventions and losing sight of the huge, broad landscape, where that needle is and how we need to move it, that really determines the course of our nation and the character of our lives. This is no easy question that you have before yourselves. I will leave you with a very profound parting comment, which is, we are getting killed out there. Thank you very much. Questions? Questions? Joan?
I know you've written about and talked about student debt, and I think for the group here that might be one of the most pressing issues. Could you talk a little bit more about, I mean, it's here now, the $1 trillion. What do you suggest we do?
I would love to talk about student debt. So The good news on student debt is the threshold of the fact that we now have $1 trillion in outstanding student loans, has really served as a wake-up call. I think it set alarm bells off among the public. It has set alarm bells off among policymakers at the state and federal level. I think the challenge that we face is twofold. I think we have to figure out ways to deal with the $1 trillion that currently exists. And then from a structural question, we have to change the trajectory we are on so that we don't get to $2 trillion. Neither of those are easy to solve. Neither are going to be politically easy to move. I think Demos and lots of great organizations, including folks that are doing organizing in communities, in college campuses, are all beginning to sort of try and come together and align our strategies to bring some real student debt relief to the folks that are carrying that $1 trillion. On the table are ideas like greater refinancing, particularly if the federal government could purchase private loans, which have exorbitant interest rates and very little options for repayment, good repayment terms, and refinance them into federal loans that would be eligible for income-based repayment. So there's lots of those kinds of ideas on the table. I would like to say that some kind of economic stimulus in the form of great student debt relief was on the table. It's not. But I'm optimistic that the conversation about how we provide access to college is beginning to change. And I think there is a growing awareness that a debt for diploma system is not sustainable, and it's not the best way for our nation to ensure that we have the number of college graduates we need, and that we're giving people a chance to meet their aspirations and get ahead. Yeah.
I think your three factors, the three factors that you laid out were very compelling, the broad sweep of how we got here over the past 30 plus years. One element that I didn't hear that I'm wondering if you would comment on is the cost of health care. Northeastern is among those who published really great information about the number one cause for financial distress in this region is a healthcare crisis, you look at household by household. And then we also hear that one of the big drivers for increased tuition costs, for example, is healthcare. So if you could just talk about that factor a little bit, please.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think certainly there is some indication that at the state level, budgets are being squeezed from many directions. One, there's a revenue squeeze that has happened as the amount of revenues, particularly post-recession, have declined. But they're also being squeezed by other needs in the state, and healthcare is certainly a big one. So I think it's an important aspect. I would put it probably in terms of magnitude a notch below the revenue problem that we have, and probably on the same footing as other things that are squeezing out the budget, like the growth in prison and the money that is spent on incarcerating folks. So there are lots of trade-offs. Budgets are I believe budgets are moral documents. And when we look at a lot of the decisions, whether it's continued, a corporate subsidy for a couple $100 million, or building and funding a new prison, those come at a trade-off. But yes, rising healthcare costs is certainly important in terms of the overall shape of the budget. Looks like there's one all the way in the back.
So, hear me okay?
Yes.
About this? So my question is, what would you say are 1, 2, or 3 things as a call to action to us to follow up on the issues that you raised?
Wow, what a luxurious question to be able to answer. Call to action. Well, one of them is the reason you all are here, which is to think very carefully and deliberately and big about getting involved in policy and advocacy. You know, I often feel like the good work we're trying to do is a bit like trying to push a boulder up a mountain, and we need, this is a horrible metaphor that because it's so anti-environment, we need to level the mountain. Not from a energy production standpoint, but from a metaphor standpoint, we really do need to level the mountain so we're not constantly trying to push a boulder up a mountain. And that is what public policy does. So I would say be bold and get engaged in policy and advocacy, which many of the folks that are in this room are already doing that. I would also say that we have been engaged in a real war of ideas, and right now the side of sort of investing in the common good and the idea that an economy grows from the middle class out and from the working class up is not where our conversation is right now. And so think about investing in ideas. And that leads to the third, which is think about playing a longer game. It seems that folks that are in all the think tanks fall in this category too, that are really dedicated to serving the public interest and expanding things like opportunity and asset building, for a whole set of reasons, are playing a short game. And this is a long game. And foundations that have really dedicated themselves to advancing sort of free market ideas have been engaged in a very long game and have made open-ended investments knowing that there's not going to be deliverables at the end of year one that show the massive cultural and political change they're seeking. So long game, ideas, and just do it. Level the mountain. Oh, God. That's what happens when I come up with metaphors on the fly. Sorry. One more question.
Thank you for your very thoughtful presentation. I come from what we call the great state of Maine, and I came down today on a 6 o'clock bus in the morning.
Wow.
What we're finding there is a diminishment of confidence on the role of the public in a 4-year university. That is, there is becoming more and more support for 2-year colleges rather than for 4-year in graduate school. And it seems to pervade a lot of public policy now in our state. And I just wondered if you've seen that in states with larger populations, given we're so strapped for public funds, given our small population.
Yeah, no, that's it's interesting because Maine actually has one of just probably in the last 5 years a really great program, which is free tuition, and if you agree to stay in the state at state universities. So, you know, I think one of the issues is the public system of state colleges and universities is strained beyond belief. The community college system is strained even further, and historically has been funded at some estimates are that for every dollar from the state that a 4-year university gets, a community college gets 30 cents. So if you think about the role that community colleges are being asked to play, it's significant, it has expanded, and it is not going to go away. So I think the president has rightly sort of tried to lift up and get more money to community colleges because they desperately need it. At the same time, I haven't seen a trend where you see a sort of taking from the four-year universities and giving to the community colleges. But I'm not the best person to ask that question, but I would be interested in seeing if that is happening elsewhere. Thank you. All right, thank you very much.